and that isn't the issue. You can hear from local representatives 364 days a year. You only get to hear from me tonight. So it's not that easy to correct the imbalances. There's a lot of pressures, and I can't think of, there's not one English language publication in the United States. There's not one English language publication in the United States that covers Middle East affairs that will consistently print the people that I've quoted to you tonight, with one exception. The Nation is not bad. The Nation tries. It's also owned by liberal American Jews. They try. They don't go as far as I think they should, but they do a far better job than anybody else.
What about the college?
Well, that's the British publication. It's conservative, it's right-wing, it's beautifully written. Even though its bias is very pro-Israeli, the entire British press is so much better than ours on foreign affairs issues. I mean, everybody knows that. Most of the stuff that comes off my fax machine is from The Guardian, or The Telegraph, or The Economist. Much better publications. The British no longer have an empire, and they're a little more free to discuss the realities of the world, it seems.
Mark, original population versus with immigration, what is it, 4 million population now, what is it?
Well, my figures could be off, but I give you general figures. After World War II, 95% of what is today Greater Israel, including the occupied territories, was Arab-owned. More than 95% was Arab-owned. The population of Jews after World War II was, I believe, 300,000 or 400,000. The Jews emigrated after the Holocaust, and they emigrated rightly, because where were they going to go? The Americans didn't let them in. The Americans turned away ships of immigrants. Europeans didn't want to let them in. The Americans were only all too glad to tell the Palestinians, you take them. Christian Europe had killed off the Jews. And had I been alive then, my suspicion is that I would have worked in the Jewish underground, helping people leave Europe and go to what was British-controlled Palestine at the time. But for the Palestinians, they looked at the situation and said, well, what the hell's going on here? You Europeans killed the Jews. Now you're shipping them to us. We have nothing to do with it. And you've created a Zionist movement 100 times bigger than the movement that existed before World War II. And why should we pay the price that they're coming to take our country when you guys, number one, were the ones who brought it, you meaning Christian West. And I think they have a very good point. Now, the situation is somewhat reversed, because the Israelis have done everything possible to push Palestinians out, to demoralize them, and don't allow them to return. You have about 2 million living under Israeli occupation in Gaza and the West Bank. And you have maybe 3 million living in exile. Maybe even more, maybe 4 million. So anyway, you have 5 or 6 million Palestinians in the world, most living in exile. The Israelis, of course, have brought in everybody under the sun, everybody they could convince to come. And they've gotten the Americans to pay for a lot of it. Who paid for the resettling of Soviet Jews in Israel? The United States paid for it. And most of the Soviet Jews didn't want to go to Israel. They did want to leave the Soviet Union, but they wanted to go to Germany or France or America. We just wouldn't let them come here, so we were glad to ship them off there. Now, that's why when you asked, I gave you what the honest but unfashionable answer. An awful lot of Arabs, even if there were a Palestinian state, would still reach the conclusion that this is totally unfair. They took our country, and this is an Arab country in the Arab world, and we don't want a Western Jewish American-sponsored state living here. I can see their point, but I also said that the great majority of them would accept it. It wouldn't be a totally just solution, but at least it would be an acceptable solution. At least it would have some dignity to it. At least there would be some measure of justice. Not far from real justice, but it would defang and de-escalate and defuse the tremendous hatred that currently exists because one party has everything, the other party has nothing.
Can you visualize the possibility of a Palestinian state?
Of course.
Where?
Where they live. They live. And that's why it wouldn't be totally fair, because they used to live in many other places too, but they live in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. The Israelis are doing everything they can to gobble it up. There's 130-some Jewish settlements in these areas. Jerusalem has been tremendously expanded by the Israelis, and you find Jewish apartments all over the place surrounding Palestinian areas. But at least you would have a measure of equality and justice with a Palestinian state. But realize that is the opposite of what is currently being done. What's currently being done, separation, in my view, is closer to apartheid than it is to independence. And autonomy is reservations. So, although I can envision it in theory, I think the main goal of the Israeli Labor Party in agreeing to what they agreed to was to co-opt Yasser Arafat, to gain good press headlines, to work with Bill Clinton, who was their man anyway, and to use the next period of time to purposely make a Palestinian state impossible. That's the Israeli goal. But there's no way. How can you have a Palestinian state? How can you have a Palestinian state if this is the map of the area? And what they also forgot to tell you is that they're spending huge amounts of money to build what they call bypass roads. Well, what is a bypass road? A bypass road is a Jews-only highway. So a Jew can travel from Tel Aviv to settlements in the occupied territories and never have to see a Palestinian and not have to worry, because Palestinians can't go on those roads. In fact, Palestinians can't go anywhere. They have to stay in the town where they come from. If they have a pass, they might be able to go visit another town. Right now, if you're a Palestinian living in Bethlehem, and it has been this way for 3 or 4 years, Labor Party law, you cannot go to Jerusalem. It's not that you can't get by the roadblock. You can't go. It's illegal for you to go. These are all things you're not told. And there's a good reason you're not told, because when you hear about it, if it's true, and some of you must be saying, is it true? It sounds awful. It sounds, how can this be peace? How can this be something that's going to last? Well, the answer is, I don't believe the Israelis intend for it to last. I think they're perfectly happy to work with Yasser Arafat while he does what he's told. And if he happens to get assassinated, preferably by Hamas, well, it's not so bad either. After all, he'll do the dirty work. He'll sign the documents. He'll legitimize our policies. And then we can always say that, these are fanatical, terrible people. They kill each other. What can we do? Their game plan is a little bit off-kilter, because it was Rabin who got assassinated first. But that they really did not plan, I don't think.
If you'd have been in President Bush's shoes when the Iraqis went into Kuwait, what would you have done in response to that? You'd have some kind of more just reaction.
Well, but it didn't start when the Iraqis went into Kuwait. By the time the Iraqis went into Kuwait, they had already been tricked into doing what we and the Israelis wanted them to do. There were all kinds of options involved. First of all, we've worked with Saddam for 10 years already. He's a cutthroat dictator. So is Hafez's son. So is the King of Saudi Arabia. And if you think King Hussein of Jordan is much better, he's just a lot slicker. He was educated in British universities. He knows how to get his wife out in front of the crowd and give a nice talk. I have all kinds of articles about what the Muhammad does to people in Jordan who speak up, and all kinds of repression of the press. He just does it with a greater finesse. So, but not to avoid your question, although, it's so theoretical, a person like myself could never be in such a position, because a person like myself would make decisions based on justice and morality and what makes sense in the long term and the so-called values that we claim to have, whereas George Bush any president of the United States is required to do what the military-industrial complex and the intelligence community want. I mean, a president comes and goes. If you live in Washington, what you find is that, people like Jimmy Carter come and go. They're useful. They do what they were elected to do by the constituents that elected them. The people who stay are the people in the lobbies, in the intelligence community, in the military. Those are institutions that have fixed policies, and those policies aren't necessarily dependent on who happens to be president. But to be even more specific, one could have easily said what George Bush said in the first 24 hours. If you go back and research the history of that period, it's almost as if George Bush wasn't in on the whole scam, which could be. I'm not so sure that George Bush knew what Ambassador Glaspie had told to Saddam Hussein. If you remember the infamous exchange where the American ambassador tells the president of Iraq, when he's got 100,000 troops on the border with Kuwait, we're not all that concerned with the internal border issues between Arab countries. Well, what more of a green light do you need? But it's almost as if Bush was preoccupied with other issues, and then in the first 24 hours, he seems to be pretty easygoing about this. And then 2 or 3 days later, all of a sudden, George Bush is on the warpath, as if he'd gotten his orders or he'd been fully briefed on what's expected of him. And then, if you also look very carefully at what happened, every time a diplomatic settlement was possible, every time the Iraqis let American hostages go, they didn't have to let American hostages go. Primakov from the Soviet Union and Gorbachev went back and forth trying to arrange a diplomatic settlement. The Arab League met, and the Arab League was supposed to work this out themselves. But every single time, just go back and check the diplomatic history, George Bush would get up, would insult the Iraqis, would call Saddam Hussein names, would use every psychological trick in the book to prevent a resolution of the conflict. And I think his greatest fear was that Saddam Hussein was going to actually pull out of Kuwait before the American military was ready to attack him. And also, you'll remember when the American military went into the Gulf, just read the dispatches, read the press outlines. We assured the entire world we were putting our troops there to protect Saudi Arabia. We ensured, we told everyone that our troops were not going to be offensive, they were not going to be used to take any offensive action, that this was defensive in order to protect Saudi Arabia from Saddam Hussein. So you've got to watch the nuances, and you've got to actually remember the details of what happened, because if you don't, you sort of get trapped into the popular myths of what happened, which is usually not what really happened.
Mark, Rabin was assassinated by a young Jewish militant instead of the Hamas, so to speak. That's bothered me a little bit, unless he is maybe of the same kind of persuasion that you are, for instance. Could you shed a little light on that?
I'm not so sure about the analogy between...
I don't know. I'm not so sure about the analogy either. But here he is, a right-winger in the Jew murdering his own...
Wait a minute. You forgot who this man was. He was a third-year law student at a prestigious Israeli university, which is extremely competitive. You don't get to be a third-year law student if you're some crazy kook without a lot of brains in your head. You also may or may not know that he worked for the Israeli Shin Bet.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, well, maybe they forgot to tell you out here in Wheeling.
Yeah.
The assassin of Rabin worked for the Israeli Secret Service previously. The reason he was able to get through the lines and stand around for 20 minutes is he had Secret Service identification. All the extremist in the sense that he was an extreme Israeli nationalist, an extreme believer in the greater Israel concept. But he was a man of academic accomplishment and a man of considerable intelligence. And fanatic, yes, and also misguided, because I don't think he realized what Rabin was all about. I think he didn't realize that Rabin's occasional gestures to the Palestinians were just window dressing. Rabin was getting everything he wanted. He was getting autonomy accepted by the world as a settlement of the Palestinian problem. The Palestinians didn't accept it. Intellectuals didn't accept it. People like me said it's not going to work. But the world was accepting it. McNeil was accepting it. Politicians were accepting it. In the end, I'm sorry to have to say this, but obviously I'm sorry. In the end, I don't matter. What I as an expert tell you doesn't really matter very much because it has no resonance. I reach tonight 50 people. TV program will reach a few thousand people. The New York Times tomorrow reaches millions and millions of people, and I keep calling it McNeil there. I know it's just Blair now. They reach millions of people. So everything I say gets terribly is practically irrelevant. And the same is true for Chomsky, the same is true for Said. Where I think what we say really matters is that when things collapse, when in the future there's more war, there's more hatred, there's more terrorism, then you may remember, well, we had that guy, I don't remember his name, and seems to have been there a lot, and he told us things were going to get bad. He told us it just wasn't going to work. The peace process was terribly flawed, maybe fatally flawed. But it's a little bit like that congressional hearing that I told you about. While the war was taking place, we all believed what that woman told us. Because could any of us believe that a PR firm would bring in front of the Congress, in front of the world, a woman who then turns out to be the ambassador's daughter, and who we now have records that say she wasn't even in Kuwait and didn't see any of this? None of us would have believed it. But 6 months later they told us, and then what did we do about it? We said it's too late now, it's over. Well, I'll tell you what I think we need to do as Americans. We need to say that when a public relations firm takes millions of dollars from a foreign country and then lies on purpose to the American people and the American Congress, that the head of that public relations firm, in this case Jody Powell, should be indicted and should be sitting in blue uniform so that these things don't happen again. And if we don't do that, then they will happen again.
Who is supplying Israel with their oil now?
Egypt, natural gas from Oman.
At one point I understood it was Iran.
Look, nothing would surprise me. The deals that governments make behind people, we all know the Americans and the Israelis were giving arms to Iran at the same time that we were condemning them. They're also, this dual containment policy. Don't rule out a war with Iran, sir. The Israeli lobby and other interest groups are pushing forward the idea that Iran is now the main enemy in the region. You heard what Peres said at the quote-unquote terrorism conference. The Iranians represent an independent force. They're building weapons of mass destruction. Well, of course they're building weapons of mass destruction. If you were a leader in Iran and you saw what the United States had just done to Iraq next door, would you not be building weapons that might deter the Americans from doing that to you? So of course they're building them. Not to mention the fact that who gave the Israelis nuclear weapons? The Americans gave. And that information is available to you too. Seymour Hersh has written The Samson Complex. Here you've got a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who happens to be Jewish. And why did he write it? I know him, and he's a friend of mine. I think he wrote the book as a warning. He wrote the book to say nuclear weapons in the Middle East are out of control. We Americans arm the Israelis. The Israelis have the Samson Complex, meaning that if they're challenged, they will use nuclear weapons against the other countries in the region. Well, that's something we better stop, and I don't think we can stop it by saying to the rest of the world, okay, we now have a non-proliferation treaty. Those of us who have them, it's okay. Those of you who don't have them, it's too bad. It's just not going to work. You can do this for a period of time, but over a long period of time, if one major country in the region develops weapons of mass destruction, the other countries are going to try to have weapons of mass destruction. So, a long-winded answer that went far astray from what you actually asked. But
Before we wrap this up, Mark, if I can make this observation, in the last couple of weeks, Mr. Arafat has said that he, too, is upset about the killings by the Hamas in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and that he intends to look for the killer or killers that has perpetrated this act. And I think that we know that, or at least it has been observed that he is serious about this, because last week he was observed on a golf course with O.J. Simpson. No?
Which golf course was that? Was he carrying O.J.'s bags for some more money?
No.
Yeah.
But he's going to find the real killer, as O.J. is.
Yasser Arafat's going to do what he's told, because he's positioned himself so that he has no choice. But Yasser Arafat's been used, and he's been turned into a collaborator, and everybody knows it, and we know why. Because he places more value on staying in power than he does on principle. And he's always been that way. But the Israelis have got him right where they want him. And they will squeeze him. And in my view, as I said before, they will be the first ones to mourn his passing, like they did with Anwar Sadat. And they'll be the first ones to say how terrible it is. But who will have brought it about? This is a man who one day goes to the home of the martyr Yahya Ayash and pays homage to the man who had blown up Israeli buses before. Then his secret service provides Israel the information to blow up Ayash. And then Arafat waits 2 days, hoping the whole thing will boil over, and then the pressures are so great that he has to go to the home of Ayash and pay homage to the man who he helped to kill. Everybody knows what has become of Yasser Arafat. He's the hired policeman. I'll use a worse analogy, and for the Jews in the audience, it's not an analogy I use lightly, and it just pains me to do so. But you'll remember the cockles. You'll remember during the Holocaust that there were Jews who worked with the Nazis, and they were given special treatment. They weren't killed. And they were given clubs, and their job was to take care of the other Jews. And you'll also remember that when the Germans took over France, when they occupied France, they set up a government in Vichy France. And Marshal Pétain was the head of that government. He was a Frenchman who the Nazis installed as the head of occupied France. And had they won the war, he probably would have been a big hero and gone down in the history books as the man who saved France from destruction. In reality, we all now think of Vichy France as sort of the symbol of a quisling occupational government. Well, what is Yasser Arafat? He's the collaborator of the Zionist regime. He's the capo of the Palestinians, and he's the Vichy France of today's Middle East. And it's unpopular to say this because you don't get invited back to have dinner with Yasser Arafat, which I've already had, and frankly wasn't all that interesting to begin with, to be honest with you. And you're smiling, maybe you got dinner with him too.
Mark, what's this is a complete change. What's this little bone of contention between Yemen and that little principle, or that little country across the Red Sea from them? You don't hear very much about it.
You mean Eritrea?
Yeah, Eritrea.
You're outside my... I've been to Ethiopia.
Have you been to Eritrea?
No, but I had a girlfriend from there once. I don't understand the Eritrean situation, other than the fact that it was an autonomous region in Ethiopia, and after the revolution against Haile Selassie, they wanted to be independent, and they finally became independent.
I thought that you might know more about that.
But you've been a very attentive audience. I have a feeling I'm trying your patience, and that you've had enough, at least for one night, about the Middle East. So thank you again for inviting me.
I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.